The New York Times has a new project marking 400 years since the first African slaves were brought here to the U.S. The 1619 series is a collection of essays, photos, and poems, pushing readers to rethink African American history. The series tells painful stories of the criminal justice system and the brutality of capitalism, but it also highlights the contributions of African Americans to the very foundation of democracy. So here with me now is a contributor to the 1619 project, Linda Villarosa. She focused on the history of racism in medicine in America. She's also a professor at the City College of New York. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
So people will hear about this project and say, well, I've heard about slavery already. I've heard about the history of slavery, or I've already heard about the contributions of African Americans that had been ignored and now they're being recognized. But this series takes it a step further. It's essentially saying, you know, America could not be America without slavery. Explain why this series is so important.
So what it tries to do is to shift the focus from 1776, which is the founding of the United States, to say, actually, it was 1619. Because if you start at 1776, you miss the contributions of enslaved people in the country. And so it's also asking to go deeper. This isn't just Black History Month. It's about more than Harriet Tubman, though it can be about her. And it's more than about the heroes that we know. It's also asking you to look painfully in depth at what happened to African Americans, and then how we still have remained here and been resilient and are in fact very attached to the democracy that we helped to build.
And that in fact enslaved people embody the high ideals, the founding ideals, and have throughout this entire time pushed America to make those ideals real.
Exactly. Pushed America to be better, pushed America to be fairer, and are more progressive minded than other Americans in surveys. And I'm really proud of that, given how much pain and torture there was during enslavement.
Speaking of that, your focus is on medicine, and it's a tough read. And you don't even make it as tough as it could be. It was sort of light, but you identify sort of different times or different ways in which African Americans were experimented on, used essentially to justify the cruelty of slavery, creating science to justify the cruelty of slavery, and the misuse of science still echoes today. I don't know where to even start with I guess, give me some examples, some of the examples that you've highlighted in your article.
So I begin with the story of John Brown, who was owned or lent to a physician called Thomas Hamilton. And Thomas Hamilton first used him to experiment for a cure for heat stroke, but then he became really interested in figuring out if black skin was thicker than white skin. So he did really cruel experiments that involved burning beneath the skin, under the assumption that John Brown had some superpower against pain. And so luckily for John Brown, he went on to write his own book, and which was rare in, you know, enslaved people. And the reason I chose that example of the pain sensitivity and pain tolerance is because it's still believed by doctors and medical students today. And so I cite two surveys, but the one that's most well known was a 2016 survey that found that medical students and residents still believe myths about African American pain tolerance, as well as myths about the thickness in skin that Thomas Hamilton tortured John Brown to prove.
And so as a result, even today, African Americans don't get the pain medication that their white counterparts would get, because the belief is, well, you can probably take it, or, you know, maybe you don't really need the medication for pain management, maybe you want it for some other reason.
That's very true. And it's also true that, you know, Black people ourselves believe these myths sometimes. So it causes you to avoid medical care, or to say, oh, this doesn't hurt, because you believe the myth too. So that also I found the most troubling.
You also touch on the father of modern gynecology.
So J. Marion Sims, I'm using father with quotes. Well, what he did was he experimented for a cure for fistula, which is an extreme side effect, negative side effect of childbirth. And so he used mainly 3 enslaved women, Anarcha, Betsy, and Lucy, for these experiments. And he also had them act as nurses for each other. So they had to hold each other down and other enslaved women as he experimented without anesthesia. Part of the time it wasn't invented yet, but also just under the assumption that these women didn't feel as much pain, or I'm not even sure what the assumption was. But now there is this cure for fistula, and fistula is mainly a problem of women in Africa. So it's very ironic that all this has come full circle.
Right.
The good thing is, I think, J. Marion Sims is no longer considered the father of modern gynecology. He's considered someone who tortured women, and his statue was removed in Central Park recently after protests of women wearing blood-stained robes to honor the women.
He had been celebrated for treating sort of empresses and treating slaves. And in fact, he wasn't treating slaves.
No.
He was experimenting on them.
He was experimenting, and the only reason he was treating them is because they were property. So he needed them to be able to work, and their owners needed them to be able to work. So that was the reason for the treatment, not for some benevolent reason, and it was mainly to perfect the surgery for white women.
Right, and then there's this business of African Americans and lung capacity, which was used to justify the abuse of African Americans in the field, that they didn't have the same lung capacity, so you needed to drive them hard to improve their lung capacity.
I'm trying not to laugh because it seems so absurd.
Yeah.
And Samuel Cartwright it began with Thomas Jefferson. So he, in a treatise he wrote in 1787, had a kind of throwaway line about lung inferiority of black people, which is ironic for him, of course. And then Southern doctors and scientists picked that up in order to justify not just slavery, but also make it seem beneficial. So then Samuel Cartwright was the person who really took it to another level, both that myth as well as the myth that there's this disease called drapetomania. And drapetomania is an illness, an affliction that made slaves run away, not because of the cruel institution of slavery, but because of this mental illness.
Right.
And so the cure for it was making them work harder.
Right.
And whipping them harder.
Yeah.
So all of this is strange, but it was used to justify slavery. It's used to justify the money earning potential of slavery and the power the southern states had during the years of slavery.
And even today, when lung capacity is measured, and the concept of a diminished lung capacity, it's measured against the sort of white male sort of benchmark. And even though it seems innocuous, if you will, it's suggesting that the standard is a white male standard, and then anything that deviates from that is something sort of abnormal, and that still exists today.
So in modern spirometers, they have a 10 to 15% race correction that assumes that we are inferior by 10 to 15% in lung capacity. So if it could affect your treatment if you're getting your lung capacity measured. It also is used in lawsuits, occupational lawsuits, so that could also affect, if you were harmed at your job, your lungs, and then the spirometer that's using a race correction is incorrectly measuring your lung capacity. That's just not fair.
So this project has received a lot of praise, but a lot of pushback as well. I think Newt Gingrich said basically it was all based on lies. None of it is really true. And this is like an extensive project that he's probably only seen a portion of at this point. What do you make of the pushback? Why is it so difficult for this country to talk about slavery openly?
I'm going to say I'm used to the pushback because I write about race, inequality, and health. So I get a lot of pushback, mainly from doctors who know I'm not a physician. So I get a lot of pushback that way. So I'm basically the slap-down queen with black and medical statistics. But I think part of the problem is that the education around slavery and the years are not robust, and it's assumed that there were these 250 years of enslavement, and then the slaves were freed, everything's fine, please stop talking about it. Also, teachers themselves complain that they don't have enough grounding in the education to teach slavery. And so if you don't know the facts, then you don't know the facts. And I think
but there seems to be almost here's an opportunity to learn the facts. And some people are rejecting it outright. They don't want to learn.
I think it's hard because when I'm trying to be empathetic, but if you feel that talking about enslavement makes you, and your discomfort with it you immediately go to, I'm not a racist.
Right.
So when I think about it and when I write, I try not to make accusations to individuals. What I try to do is say there are institutions in this country that if you trace back their history using a data-driven and fact-based and historical information, you can trace some of our present-day issues to slavery. And it's interesting to know this. It's important to know this. It's also important to nod toward our achievements. It's also important to nod toward our pain, and that we have come out of this in a resilient way.
I don't know if you caught wind of kind of something that went viral on the internet, a review of a plantation tour. And it was a complaint review that it wasn't very good because all they did was talk about slavery. And then there was a lot of pushback, and people said, how can you go to a plantation and not expect to discuss slavery? Where do you think that sentiment comes from? Are we that disconnected from the roots of this country that one could go to a plantation and not want to spend very much time talking about slavery?
So the most read book of the 19th century was Uncle Tom's Cabin. So it was an anti-slavery novel.
Yeah.
On the other hand, it had these really terrible stereotypes of black people. The most read book of, and this is behind the Bible, both of these cases, the most read book of the 20th century is Gone with the Wind. There are 30 million copies in print. So if this is what slavery looks like, happy slaves or very stereotypical black people, I think we need a re-education. People who are teachers who grew up with this. And there's a newer generation that is struggling to learn this. And I want to say that part of the 1619 Project is to expand upon the teaching that's already going on. There are pockets of places where teachers are saying, wait, I need to do better. I need to teach more about slavery, not just the Civil War and here's a war reenactment, but to say this is an important moment in history that was long going. It's 250 years and 50 more years of state-sanctioned segregation. This is important to know and understand.
Somebody like me, I'm going to read this, right? How do you encourage, though, other people who are uncomfortable with this topic to seek out these articles and embrace them?
So I'm a college professor, so I got some notes from my students saying, thank you, thank you for writing your piece, which I know mine was the only one they read. So I said, why don't you try to read the shorter pieces, okay? Go to the curriculum, which is at the Pulitzer Center, and look at how Nicole Hannah-Jones, who is the brainchild of this, look at how she takes you through it. It isn't that difficult, and plus, once you start reading it, you get engrossed. I was very interested in the income inequality part, the traffic in Atlanta being a product of segregation. Very interesting. This is interesting stuff. Plus, there are contributions from artists, from writers, playwrights, novelists, poets. So even if you don't love history, you can at least dig into the beauty of the art.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to sell it. Linda Villarosa, thank you very much.
Thank you.